I'm still looking at slide 10. I should mention that this movie, Lust Caution, was based on a novel by Eileen Chang, C-H-A-N-G, Eileen Chang, who lived in Taiwan after the revolution. So she wrote this very short story. It's only 80 pages long or something like that, which became Lust Caution, the story that was used for the movie. And she wrote this story in the early 1950s. She did actually base it on the assassination attempt by Zheng Pingru, who was a Kuomintang, a Zongtong agent, I always get these. I always have to stop and think about these these names. A not military statistics bureau. That was the military side of the Kuomintang intelligence, but the Bureau of Investigations and Statistics. That's it. It came under the Kuomintang Central Committee. There's been a lot of writing about this in China in the Chinese language, and that's where I'm getting all this stuff from. Move on to slide 11. So the retreat, the nationalist retreat to Chongqing, took about a year and a half. As I say, this was a very bloody and unbelievable war that Japan waged in China, and it is the root of the hatred between those two peoples, not to mention everything that they did in Korea, the enmity felt by Koreans toward Japanese, and vice versa, that exists to this day, that you will encounter if you travel in the region later on in your careers. The major battles that ensued between the two sides were caused enormous casualties, as I've already said. And it was the usual problem, really, just like in the 1894-95 war between China and Japan. China had a lot more troops. Back then they had more ships, but they just weren't all deployed to the battlefield. The Japanese had fewer troops, but they had far superior firepower and maneuver. They had bombers, they had fighters, they had modern Navy ships, they had modern transport, both ground, sea, and air, to move their forces around. It's all about fire and maneuver, and that is why the Japanese rolled back the Chinese troops and killed them in extraordinary numbers. Because the average Chinese division was underarmed, and I've got a reference here if you want to take a look in the readings to where Taylor describes a typical Chinese division that had only about 1/3 the number of rifles that it needed for its troops, much less any artillery support. That's key if you want to defend against an attacking enemy. Entire institutions were moved upriver because Chiang Kai-shek accurately realized that he'd be in Chongqing for a long time. So entire universities and other institutions, including all the government ministries, were moved to Chongqing. And this was done, this was an enormous human effort. This was done by people who were, they were called coolies back in that day. These were peasants who were drafted into service. Sometimes they were paid by the nationalist government, sometimes they were virtual slaves. And they each had a rope, and they would pull boatloads of machinery and books and everything else you can think of upriver, up the Yangtze River, under enormously difficult conditions. There are photographs you can find on the web if you look for this sort of thing. So Chiang Kai-shek settled into a war of attrition because he knew he had plenty of people to expend. There are always more. There are always more where they came from. It's a very difficult, very tragic situation. He decided in his diaries, as Taylor notes, that instead of just committing 3 or 4 divisions for every Japanese division that was attacking, he would commit 6 to 9 infantry divisions, which meant this, basically, this is where the whole human wave tactics thing came from. It wasn't a Chinese communist invention. It was something that was used before that by the Chinese nationalists against the Japanese. When I say human wave tactics, I'm referring to what the Chinese did in Korea a decade later. We'll get to that, though. Going on to slide 12. So to prosecute this war that cost Japan enormous amounts of money, that took a lot of oil, that took a lot of steel, the Japanese decided in steps that they would have to attack the Americans and the British in Asia, and that they would attack the Americans in Hawaii to disable their Pacific Fleet. As we discussed a moment ago, they've done this before. The French had done this before them in the war that they had with China in 1880. The sneak attack, as people like to call it, was not actually a Japanese invention. It's something that they observed a successful foreign power doing in China, and so they followed up I don't know if there was a direct connection, but one came before the other, that's for sure. So the Japanese concluded that the only way to expand into Southeast Asia, the only way to continue the war in China was to expand into Southeast Asia, because down in Southeast Asia they had oil, they had rubber, they had tin, all these things that were the food for the monster that is modern warfare. The Americans had been gradually placing trade restrictions on Japan because of what they were doing in China. A lot of historians, I have to say I'm not neutral about this, a lot of historians today like to say, well, can we really blame the Japanese for attacking the Americans at Pearl Harbor and attacking the British in Southeast Asia? Look at what we were doing to them. Why, we were cutting them off from steel and oil to try to discourage them from killing masses of civilians in China. I find that argument appalling, but it's one that's commonly made today. But I don't want to get off on a tangent. The negotiations that continued between the Americans and the Japanese eventually broke down, and you probably know the rest from another history course. So let's go on to slide 13. The Japanese quickly expanded in the Pacific because the Americans were only partially prepared to oppose them. However, there was quickly I don't want to get too far off the mark here because we're talking about China, but these events heavily influenced what happened in China. The reversal of Japanese fortunes at the Battle of Midway, very early in the war, in 1942, had an immediate effect because it showed that the Japanese would not be able to continue to expand, nor would they necessarily be able to hold the positions that they had taken throughout the Pacific, which ultimately threatened their ability to prosecute their war in China. It also showed that they would not necessarily be able to expand to the west and invade India. As Japan's air and naval power gradually was destroyed over the course of the next year and a half, it became apparent to communist leaders in China and nationalist leaders in China that what they needed to do was to hold on, to preserve their forces, to no longer throw thousands and thousands of people into the meat grinder. Not that the communists ever did that, that it was the nationalists who did that. But Chiang Kai-shek, in particular, came to the conclusion that he needed to preserve his forces because eventually Japan would collapse. It might take many, many years, but that was it seemed the inevitable end to this great conflict, and afterwards Chiang Kai-shek would be facing the communists. Going on to slide 14, there was an almost immediate consequence in China that affected military operations of the nationalists and the communists there. The rapid advance that the Japanese had undertaken in that country led immediately to an overreach, in particular as forces were withdrawn. 1 million men were withdrawn from China to fight the Americans in the Pacific, and this created enormous difficulties for the Japanese. They started to go into a bit of a garrison mentality, although there were several offenses that followed where they took more territory, in particular against the communists. But it's important to realize one of the elements of their downfall was their myth of Bushido. They believed that they were a race that was descended from the gods, and I'm not kidding. If you were in my course last quarter, we talked about this to some extent. There's no time to delve into it too much here, but all you have to do is, for example, is go onto the web or go into a good Japanese history book and look up Bushido, the way of the warrior, and you will find sufficient information about that. And as the war wound on and Japan was subjected to repeated defeats in the Pacific, and as more and more people were dying in China, Tojo, who had become the political leader of Japan several years before, in the late 1930s, I believe it was 1938, had to resign as prime minister. The military was still in control of the government, but they were looking for a different way to handle this broad conflict. Going on to slide 15, I've really already covered most of these points, but wanted to show you this map that indicates how far the Japanese advanced on paper and on the ground, but their advance, as their troops were withdrawn to fight the Americans in the Pacific, their advance became more and more holy, full holes, like Swiss cheese. There were so many places behind the lines where the communist 8th Route Army, the most famous of them, operated in Shandong province. That's where that's in the north there, the peninsula that points at Korea, Shandong. And the nationalists operated as well down in all sorts of areas around the country, including near, in and around Canton in the south, in the outskirts of Hong Kong. And all this time, both of the sides were trying to prepare for the post-war scenario by establishing local governments or proto-governments where they could behind Japanese lines. And the communists were the most effective at doing this. They established liaison stations that were used by the organization department to recruit members and to prepare for, in essence, to prepare a shadow government to take over once conditions swung more into their favor. And there were intelligence stations run by CCP Intelligence, which also proved to be very important later on. These networks had not existed previously. It was the Japanese invasion that allowed for this opportunity for the communists to expand as far as they did all over China. So they were not simply confined to Yan'an, is what I'm trying to say. Over there, you can see Yan'an on this map on slide 15. They were all over the place by the end of the war. Going on to slide 16, I've argued in other forums that that the recognized core businesses of the army, of the Communist Party, of the Chinese Communist Party, their main efforts, the place you would go if you wanted to be promoted, the efforts that received the most money and people and effort were the organization department under the Central Committee, the military, and the propaganda department. These are recognized by all historians and political scientists as core businesses of the Chinese Communist Party, but I argue from my own research that the intelligence department, which was founded in 1941, also a department of the Central Committee, was a core business. And one of the reasons is that in the liaison offices that were formed as part of the United Front Agreement in nationalist-held areas, from Shanghai early in the war to Wuhan, also early in the war. These were, of course, closed down as the Japanese advanced, and Chongqing and other places around the country. There are 15 of them. They were constructed like foreign embassies, and actually one prominent PRC historian has said that their first diplomatic missions were modeled on the liaison offices. And these liaison offices included people from these four, I like to call them core businesses: the military, propaganda, organization departments, and the intelligence department. And one reason why I say that intelligence was a big deal, received a lot of resources and so on, is that this man, Li Kanong, in the middle here, who was a prominent PRC, or rather CCP intelligence official, was involved in setting up many of these liaison offices. He headed a number of them over the course of time, and his people were always there in each one of them. Let's go on to slide 17. So the communists pursued three types of solutions to implement their military and intelligence operations in China and their organization department operations in China, depending on the area. I don't want to go through and read everything here. You can stop this recording and read it at your leisure. But you can see I've divided these into three types of areas: the cities under the KMT control or foreign control, which I include Hong Kong there, because until 1941, Hong Kong, of course, was under British control until December of 1941. The rural areas, either under KMT or Japanese control, and the cities under Japanese control. The use of the liaison offices and the intelligence stations differed to an observable extent between these different areas. Sometimes they were overt, sometimes they were covert. And it's interesting how they were used very effectively in order to establish what would later become the local governments in these areas. They included the establishment of provincial-level CCP committees that would later become the supervisory organizations for the provinces, governments, because in modern China today and in communist China today, local governments, the mayor, for example, is sort of like our city manager here in Portland. The mayor is not the political leader of the city in China. The mayor is the one who carries out the political program of the Communist Party's secretary for the city, for the municipality. The Communist Party secretary is actually in charge and is more like the elected mayor. In an American city, of course, there are no real elections, but I don't want to get into that. It's too early. We'll stop this recording here and go on to slide 18.